So I have this lock here. It's an old railway lock, Adlake. I have no key for this lock. There's the potential to make one via impressioning, but I don't have a blank either. So what I'm thinking is that I need to make a blank. So first step for me will be to make some measurements. What I'm going to need to do is measure this post, also measure the distance between here and here, so I can work out roughly what size tube I can get away with. And also I'm going to have to do a little bit of a measurement across here to determine the width of the blade, so again that I can try to locate a suitably sized piece of brass. Okay, now I have some brass, thank you to eBay, and it's time to buckle down and do some work. Step 1, pretty straightforward, just cut a small length of tube for the shaft of the key. Okay, now the next step was basically to cut off a small length of the brass bar to make the blade of the key. So the stock that I'm using is a little too thick to fit into the keyway. So what I've had to do is grab out the trusty files, thin this little brass square down a little bit until it was at the point where it will actually fit in the keyway. So that much is done. Okay, so something extra that I'm going to need is some way of turning the key once it's in the keyway. So what I've done is I've cut off an extra little piece of the brass bar, and I'm going to use that to use for the head of the key. Okay, now those pointy edges were going to hurt my fingers the very moment I tried to turn the key with any real pressure, so what I've quickly done is taken off a couple of those edges to make it just a little bit kinder on the fingertips. Okay, now this may not be the smoothest or best way of doing this, but what I've done is I've cut out a small section of the brass tube. Now the piece of brass that I have that I'm going to use as the head of the key will hopefully fit nice and tightly and snugly into that slot. That being the case, I can then think about doing a little bit of brazing and making that a permanent fixture. Okay, returning briefly to the piece of brass that I intend to use as the blade of the key. I've just done a little bit of extra carving on that. As you might be able to see, there is now a bit of a curve in one side of the brass, and that curve is intended to curve around the external diameter of the brass tube. Just incidentally, the tools that I use to accomplish that last task can be seen on the screen in front of you. Basically a diamond coated needle file, and to get that curve as close as I could to being correct, I took that brass tube and wrapped a little bit of sandpaper around it. A little bit dodgy, but it does work. And hey presto, we all of a sudden have some parts to make a somewhat dodgy but hopefully workable key blank from. And here is roughly how they're going to be pieced together. Okay, so it's time to do some brazing, and for my tools I have some Flux, a mini flamethrower, or rather a butane torch, and some solder, or as the Americans might say, solder. Okay, so now that we're actually at the point where we can build something from all these parts, I've gone ahead and attached the small bit of brass that was intended to be the head of the key to the brass tube. So now it's time to shuffle on and do the next thing. And that next thing that needed to be done was to attach the piece of brass that's intended to be the blade of the key to the brass tube. Done. And now finally, after a lot of digging around, we actually have what looks to be a key blank. So there you can see how that bit is joined, also how this bit is joined. Like I said, it's not the sexiest key in the world, but I'm just looking for something that works. That's all that matters to me right now. So let's just see how this has turned out. Okay, so back with the lock and the key blank. There you can have a look at the keyway. Now you know why the key had to look like that, or rather the blank had to look like that. And lo and behold, it goes into the lock. If I can get it in light, you can see, oh, it actually turns. Doesn't turn too far because it butts up against levers and things inside the lock, but at least at this point we do have something which fits in the keyway and does rotate. So if I do decide to jump onto impressioning at some point, I at least have something to start with. So there you go. Bit of a bodgy process, but at the end we have something to mess around with. Peace and respect. I'm gone. To be continued.